Before Game of Thrones, there was England, a kingdom torn apart by roses. Blood bound them. Ambition divided them. The red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York, two families, one crown, and a war that would shatter the Middle Ages. This is not legend. This is history, the true story of how England drowned in its own royal blood. Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep history alive. Because what you're about to hear is the war that birthed the Tudors and changed the world forever. When the last banners of England were torn from the walls of Bordeaux, the soldiers who carried them home did so in silence. The year was 1453, and the 100 Years' War, a century of ambition, glory, and ruin, had ended not with triumph, but with humiliation. For generations, English kings had ruled lands in France, claiming crowns that were not theirs by birth but by blood and conquest. Now, all that remained was the pale memory of Agincourt and the debts of failure. England had bled for a dream that had turned to ash. Across the Channel, France had risen united under Charles VII, and the once invincible English armies, starved of pay and purpose, dissolved into chaos. They brought home the plague of defeat, not of bodies, but of spirits. And in London, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster, a king sat praying while his kingdom began to fracture. Henry VI of Lancaster was a gentleman in an age that demanded wolves. He had inherited the crown at 9 months old, and by the time he came of age, the fire that had driven his father, the victorious Henry V, had turned to embers in him. Where his father wielded the sword, Henry clutched the Bible. He spoke softly, avoided conflict, and preferred sermons to council meetings. To his people, he was a king of peace, but to his nobles, he was a king of weakness. The treasury was empty. The war was lost. The nobles whispered, and in the quiet corridors of power, one man's name began to echo: Richard, Duke of York. Richard had blood as royal as Henry's own. Descended from Edward III through 2 lines, he believed, perhaps rightly, that his claim to the throne was stronger than the king's. But ambition alone did not make him dangerous. It was the world that made him necessary. As soldiers returned from France unpaid and hungry, England descended into lawlessness. In the north, nobles raised private armies, each wearing their colors like banners of defiance: the red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York. Peasants were pressed into service, villages were raided, and justice became a matter of strength, not law. The great lords, Somerset, Suffolk, and the Nevilles, warred in miniature, their disputes bleeding across counties. In Westminster, Queen Margaret of Anjou watched it all with growing fury. Born in France, fierce in intellect and will, she was everything her husband was not. She believed England could still be strong, but only if she ruled in his stead. Around her gathered the loyalists of Lancaster, men who saw in her a force that could preserve their fortunes and their power. But Richard of York saw something else: the shadow of tyranny, cloaked in silk. He had served loyally as commander in France, governor in Ireland, and counselor to the crown. Yet again and again, he was dismissed, ignored, or sent into exile by the very men who squandered England's wealth. Chief among them was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the Queen's closest ally and the architect of disaster in France. Somerset had lost Normandy, squandered the army, and blamed everyone but himself. Now, instead of punishment, he stood beside the king, rewarded for failure. To Richard, it was intolerable. To England, it was ruin. By the winter of 1453, the air in Westminster was thick with resentment. The nobles quarreled in council, while the king sat pale and silent, hands folded as though in prayer. And then, as if the heavens themselves had withdrawn their favor, the king's mind broke. Contemporaries wrote that Henry VI simply fell from his reason. One morning he woke and spoke to no one. He did not recognize his courtiers, his wife, or even the infant son born that same year, Prince Edward of Westminster. He sat motionless for months, eyes vacant, lips moving in prayer no one could hear. The court trembled. For the first time in memory, England had no ruler in mind or will. The Queen could not govern in his name, the law forbade it. The council was divided. So, by sheer necessity, the nobles turned to Richard of York. He was named Protector of the Realm, the de facto ruler of England. For 2 brief years, the realm tasted order again. Richard restored discipline, curbed corruption, and recalled exiled allies. But even as he worked, suspicion festered. Margaret of Anjou saw in him not a savior, but a usurper. Somerset plotted revenge, and those loyal to the Red Rose whispered that the Duke of York would not stop until the crown itself was his. The kingdom became a house divided not yet in open war, but in spirit. North fought south, court fought council, churchmen took sides, and every castle lord looked to his own defenses. By 1455, the king had recovered miraculously, perhaps, or by divine irony. The first thing he did upon awakening was to recall Somerset and dismiss York. To Richard, it was betrayal. To the Queen, it was victory. And to England, it was the final spark in a powder field. Armies began to gather, banners unfurling beneath spring skies. The men who had once fought the French now sharpened their swords against one another. At St. Albans, a quiet market town north of London, the Red Rose and the White finally met in battle. The clash was brief, a skirmish more than a war, but its meaning echoed across generations. Arrows fell like rain, armor clashed in narrow streets, and by dusk, the blood of Englishmen ran through the cobblestones. When it ended, Somerset lay dead, pierced by a spear. The king was found dazed and wounded, seated beneath a tree as his guards fled. Richard knelt before him and swore loyalty, but the truth was written in blood. The Wars of the Roses had begun. The morning after St. Albans was strangely quiet. The streets smelled of iron and wet stone. Rain had washed the blood into the gutters, but not the memory. Shop fronts were shattered, churches scarred by arrows, and corpses lay beneath torn banners, men who, days before, had called each other brothers in arms. England had fought itself, and no one yet understood what that meant. King Henry VI, rescued from the chaos by York's men, was led gently from the field. His crown was dented, his robe soaked in mud and blood. When his retainers asked who had wounded him, he only murmured prayers for the souls of the fallen. To the pious king, the battle was a sin against God. To Richard of York, it was the beginning of redemption. York and his allies Salisbury and Warwick had won the day. But victory brought no triumph, only silence. They had taken arms not against their king, they claimed, but against his evil counsel against Somerset, whose death now made that claim impossible to test. For the first time in living memory, English nobles had raised arms within sight of London. When the news reached the capital, it arrived with fear. Bells tolled for the dead. The merchants of Cheapside shuttered their stalls, waiting to see if the victors would march on Westminster. Some prayed for deliverance. Others whispered that the age of kings was ending, and England had become its own enemy. In truth, Richard of York did not want the crown, not yet. He rode into London not as conqueror but as protector, bowing to the wounded king and kneeling before the altar at St. Paul's Cathedral. Before God and court, he swore his loyalty once more. It was not rebellion, he insisted, but justice. Yet the Queen saw through him. Margaret of Anjou's husband returned from battle broken, his mind again slipping into silence. The king's eyes were empty. His will had vanished. Around his bed, the Queen gathered the survivors of her cause, men who still bore the Red Rose of Lancaster, men who had seen Somerset's corpse sprawled in the street. Their grief hardened into rage. Margaret swore vengeance. She would rebuild her faction, restore her husband's power, and destroy the House of York root and branch. Across the country, England began to divide not by loyalty but by fear. Every noble was forced to choose. Families that had lived side by side for generations found themselves torn apart by colors red and white. Servants wore badges declaring allegiance. Priests blessed banners in candlelit chapels. The word treason hung in the air like smoke. In the north, the Nevilles fortified their castles. In the west, the Percys armed their tenants. London became a city of spies. And in every market square, rumors grew faster than crops. That York sought the throne, that the Queen planned his death, that the young prince was not truly of royal blood. For 2 years, England lived in a tense and trembling peace, a peace born not of forgiveness, but exhaustion. Henry VI wandered between prayer and stupor, guided by whichever faction held him. His government became a carousel of faces. Yorkist 1 month, Lancastrian the next. Each change meant executions, confiscations, and exiles. The law lost meaning. Only the church still pretended stability. From Canterbury to York Minster, bishops preached patience, claiming the strife was a test from God. But even they began to take sides. Some blessed the red rose, others the white. In the pulpit, Christ's kingdom seemed smaller than England's quarrels. Margaret, however, never rested. From the royal court in Coventry, she began rebuilding her strength, summoning old allies, promising lands and favors, and appealing to France for support. She raised her son Edward in the creed of vengeance, that the Duke of York had slain his father's friend and stolen his peace. Richard, meanwhile, believed himself the savior of a broken realm. He returned to the north, ruling almost as a king in all but name. The common folk found his rule firm but fair. Taxes were reduced, order restored, roads patrolled by loyal men in his livery. To many, he seemed the ruler England deserved, the one it needed. But loyalty is a fickle flame. The more peace he brought, the more the crown's authority faded. Margaret's agents spread word that York's peace was a mask, that he plotted to depose her husband and place his own line on the throne. In taverns, bards sang of rebellion disguised as righteousness. The seeds of war had been planted once more. The year was 1455, and England's peace was an illusion written in trembling ink. King Henry VI, once crowned as heir to France and the hope of Christendom, now sat pale and voiceless on his throne. The first battle of St. Albans had ended with blood upon the cobblestones and the honor of kingship shattered. The war had been small, a single flash of violence, but its echo hollowed through the heart of the realm. The king's mind, already fragile, broke beneath the weight of defeat. Courtiers whispered that he stared for hours at crucifixes, lips moving soundlessly, as if in prayer. He forgot names, faces, the passing of days. He did not recognize his own counsel, nor the trembling hands that lifted his crown. England, for the first time in 100 years, had a king in body only, not in will. Into that vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of York, tall, disciplined, and sure of his divine right. York was a man who believed England needed saving, and that he was chosen to do it. In the king's silence, Parliament named him Protector of the Realm. The realm's business resumed. Laws were signed. Armies were fed. For a moment, the kingdom breathed again. Yet power rarely forgives the one who holds it. To the people, York appeared a hero, the man who could tame the chaos left by Henry's weakness. Trade resumed, wages steadied, and bandits disappeared from the highways. But in the court, eyes turned cold. None colder than those of Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret, French by birth, had long been the true force behind the throne. She was fierce, clever, and unyielding, the mirror opposite of her husband. To her, York was no savior but a usurper in waiting, the white rose creeping toward her child's inheritance. She would never forgive him for St. Albans, where her allies had been cut down beneath his banners. While York worked to restore order, Margaret worked to restore vengeance. Messengers rode north and west under cover of darkness, carrying her letters sealed in crimson wax. The Percys of Northumberland, the Cliffords, the Somersets, all were called to her cause. In the castles of the north, forges burned through the night. In their courtyards, men drilled with pikes and bows. England was quiet on the surface, but beneath the frost, the river of war ran strong again. Between 1455 and 1459, the kingdom became two nations, one ruled by law, the other by loyalty. Henry's crown gleamed still, but it rested on the hollow shell of a man. He was often seen wandering gardens, speaking softly to unseen saints. The chroniclers wrote of a monarch who thought himself in heaven, though his kingdom was falling to ruin. York's council governed in his stead, but his authority was fragile. He could issue decrees, but he could not command hearts. The nobles who followed him, Salisbury, Warwick, and others, were bound by interest, not love. The Queen's camp grew in secret strength, and the line between justice and treason blurred until no man could see it clearly. In the summer of 1456, something stirred within the king, a brief glimmer of consciousness. He woke one morning, asked for his wife, and spoke her name with tears. The miracle of recovery spread through London like wildfire. Bells rang, church choirs sang, and nobles rushed to pledge renewed loyalty. But when Henry opened his eyes to the realm, he found himself a stranger within it. His court had changed. His ministers answered to York, and his seal had been used for purposes he did not recall. Margaret saw her chance. The court was moved northward to Coventry, away from York's power in London. There, within the walls of the Lancastrian heartlands, the Queen gathered her loyalists like a general preparing for siege. The baby prince, Edward of Westminster, became her rallying cry, the living emblem of the Red Rose. She surrounded herself with those who despised York most, men who had lost fathers and brothers at St. Albans, who carried vengeance like a torch. Letters to France brought mercenaries and gold. Clergy in her favor preached sermons calling rebellion a duty to God. England's peace was dying not with a roar, but with a whisper. Meanwhile, York clung to his fragile protectorate. He sought compromise, perhaps even reconciliation. In 1458, he organized what would be remembered as the Love Day of London, a ceremony meant to heal the realm's wounds. At St. Paul's Cathedral, the great nobles of England walked hand in hand down the aisle, York beside Margaret, Warwick beside Somerset's heir. The crowd cheered as if salvation had come, but beneath the hymns and banners, hatred festered. Margaret's smile was thin and unyielding, York's cold as marble. The feast that followed glittered with silver plates and false laughter, while outside, the narrow streets of London bristled with armed men hiding in taverns and doorways. The peace of the Love Day was a masquerade. When the bells fell silent, the swords began to whisper again. Over the next months, small clashes erupted in the countryside. Bands of retainers loyal to York clashed with those loyal to Lancaster, first over boundaries, then over blood debts. The harvests failed in the north, famine spread, and rumors followed that the Queen was raising a new army. French ships were sighted off the coast of Kent, unloading weapons and gold. The smell of war was in the air, faint but inescapable. By 1459, the illusion of stability had collapsed entirely. The royal court at Coventry had become a fortress. Lancaster banners, red with the white cross of St. George, flew over the battlements. Margaret's allies spoke openly of removing York once and for all. She swore an oath before her household that her son would inherit his father's crown, or she would die securing it. The council in London warned York to stand down, but he refused. The Queen had turned loyalty into tyranny. If she wanted war, he would answer it. In the twilight of that year, two armies began to gather, one in the north under Lancaster, one in the Midlands under York. Merchants fled the towns, farmers buried their tools and took up spears. The peace forged by ceremony had withered like petals under frost. And somewhere in the dim corridors of Windsor, the king prayed. He prayed for peace, for mercy, for forgiveness. Yet his words reached no one. England was already sliding back into the abyss. The sleeping king had awoken, but too late. The realm no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the roses red and white that would soon choke the kingdom in blood. The silence that had blanketed England was about to break. By 1459, the fragile peace forged by Richard of York had turned to smoke. Letters written in secret hands flew across the realm from Coventry to York, from London to Calais, calling men to arms once more. The roses would bloom red and white again, not in gardens, but in blood. The first clash came in September, on the windy heathland of Staffordshire. There, the Queen's forces, a host of nearly 10,000, marched beneath the red rose banner commanded by Lord Audley. Their armor was polished bright, their banners heavy with vengeance for St. Albans. Against them stood a smaller Yorkist army led by Salisbury, father to Warwick, a man whose courage was born of decades of war in France. At dawn, the mists of Blore Heath curled low across the fields, swallowing the sound of horses and the whispers of fear. Salisbury's men dug in behind wagons, forming a makeshift barricade of timber and iron. They were outnumbered, but not outmatched. When Audley's cavalry charged across the wet ground, the thunder of hooves broke the morning stillness like the crack of a god's whip. Arrows hissed through the fog, thousands of them darkening the rising Sunday. Men fell before they even saw their enemies. The boggy earth turned crimson, the horses screamed and bucked, and the weight of their charge collapsed into chaos. Salisbury, old and unyielding, rode among his lines, shouting orders above the din, his sword flashing like a shard of light. By noon, Audley lay dead among his men. The red rose had withered once more, but the victory brought little joy. For Salisbury knew what every commander feared. One battle was never enough to end a war. When news of the defeat reached Queen Margaret, her fury could have scorched heaven. She called York and all his kin traitors, sending proclamations across England. Whoever aided the Duke of York would share his fate. The sleeping king, frail, devout Henry, sat beside her, nodding softly, unaware that his signature had condemned half his realm. By autumn, the armies gathered again. Richard of York marched from Ludlow with his sons, Edward and Edmund, one 17, tall and broad-shouldered, the other 15 and eager to prove himself. Behind them rode Warwick the Kingmaker, his banner bearing the bear and ragged staff. The Yorkists believed God was with them. The heavens, however, stayed silent. At Ludford Bridge, the armies met York's men on one side, the royal host on the other. This time, the red rose carried not vengeance, but legitimacy. The king himself stood with Margaret's army, his banner of the crowned lion raised high. For the first time in years, Henry's eyes were clear. He prayed before the troops, gentle and trembling, blessing the soldiers who would soon cut down his subjects. To fight him now was not rebellion, it was sacrilege. That night, fear crept through York's camp like smoke. Men whispered by torchlight that the king was no longer a puppet, that God himself had returned to favor Lancaster. And then betrayal. A division of York's army, the Calais contingent under Lord Andrew Trollope, defected to the royal side. They took with them York's plans, his banners, his pride. Before dawn, York's campfires were doused. The Duke fled under cover of darkness, Warwick to Calais by ship, York northward toward Ireland with his sons. The white rose that had seemed so bright only months before was trampled in the mud. Margaret entered Ludlow triumphant, her army looting the town as the terrified villagers watched the red banners rise once more. For a brief moment, it seemed the war was over. York had vanished across the sea. The Lancastrians reclaimed power, and Henry's court rejoiced in hollow peace. But Margaret knew better ambition, like York's, never slept for long. She tightened her grip on the kingdom, restoring her allies, seizing estates from York supporters, and placing her son, the young Prince Edward, at the center of royal propaganda. The child's small figure, dressed in crimson velvet, became a symbol of renewal, the flower of Lancaster reborn. And yet, behind every sermon of divine order, the shadow of vengeance lingered. Winter came harsh and early. In the north, famine followed war. Entire villages lay abandoned. Wolves returned to the forests, and roads between towns grew dangerous. But from Ireland came rumors, whispers that York was raising a new army, Irish and English alike, bound by oaths of blood and coin. And in Calais, Across the narrow sea, Warwick gathered ships, men, and fury. The exile had become a crusade. By December of 1460, the frost-bitten roads of Yorkshire trembled under marching feet once more. York's army advanced toward Wakefield, confident and proud. His banners of the white rose and the falcon fluttered in the bitter wind. He believed himself unstoppable after all. He was the rightful heir of Edward III's line, born to wear the crown that Henry had disgraced. But pride blinds faster than darkness. Unbeknownst to York, Margaret's forces had encircled him. Her captains, Clifford, Somerset, and Northumberland, waited with 20,000 men beyond the ridges. Their banners filled the horizon like a blood-red tide. On the morning of December 30th, 1,460 snow fell over Sandal Castle. York, standing upon the ramparts, saw movement in the valley and mistook it for retreat. He ordered his men forward, perhaps to seize glory before Warwick could arrive, perhaps to prove that God still favored his house. But the trap was already set. When York's troops charged down the slope, they were swallowed whole. The red rose banners appeared from the fog on every side, horns blaring, pikes lowering. The clash was brutal, intimate, steel against steel, breath against breath. The cries of men were drowned by the wind. Blood steamed upon the snow. York fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur, his voice carrying over the roar. But the tide was too strong. Clifford's men broke through the Yorkist flank, cutting down Edmund, the 15-year-old earl, as he tried to flee across the field. When Richard saw his son fall, witnesses said he no longer fought to live, but to die with him. He was surrounded, struck down, and taken prisoner. The Duke of York, claimant to the throne of England, was executed that same evening. His head was placed upon the gates of York with a paper crown nailed mockingly to his skull. Above the battlements, the ravens gathered. The victory was complete, but England did not cheer. The snows of Wakefield buried 10,000 dead, and the rivers ran red as spring thawed their remains. For Margaret, vengeance was justice. For England, it was prophecy. Because from the ashes of that slaughter, another figure would rise taller, bolder, unbroken. Edward, the son of York, now heir to his father's claim, gathered his banners and swore an oath that would shake the very foundations of the realm. The sleeping king's silence had birthed monsters, and one of them was about to wear a crown. The winter of 1460 bled into the new year like a wound that refused to close. England's fields lay frozen under sheets of ice, but beneath the silence, vengeance stirred. The Duke of York was dead slain at Wakefield, his head spiked above the city's gate with a mock crown nailed upon it. His 15-year-old son Edmund lay buried in the snow beside nameless men. And yet, out of that ruin, another son rose. Edward, now Duke of York, was only 18. But war had already carved hardness into his features. He had escaped the slaughter at Wakefield, retreating northward with a handful of loyal men. The news of his father's death reached him as they crossed the hills, carried by a messenger whose voice broke as he spoke the words. Edward did not answer. He merely stared toward the south, toward the white drifts that had swallowed his family's honor, and whispered a vow no one could hear. In London, fear ruled again. Margaret of Anjou, triumphant, marched south with her army, a vast host swollen with northern levies, mercenaries, and those drawn by promise of plunder. Her victory at Wakefield had lit a fire that now threatened to consume the realm. The Queen's soldiers looted towns as they passed, leaving ashes in their wake. To the south, nobles who had sworn to Lancaster now begged for the protection of York. In Calais, across the narrow sea, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, received the grim tidings. Known already as the Kingmaker, Warwick's fury was cold and calculating. He had fought alongside York's banner at St. Albans, defended his cause at Ludford Bridge, and now saw in young Edward a mirror of his father, but fiercer, more decisive, unburdened by caution. England trembled, divided not merely by loyalty, but by fear itself. The king Henry VI wandered through his victory as if lost. He gave thanks for triumphs he could not comprehend, smiling faintly while his wife ruled in his name. Margaret believed God had delivered her enemies into her hands, but the storm she had unleashed was far from over. Edward's army gathered in the frozen fields near the Welsh border, archers from the marches, knights from the shires, and hardened men from Calais ferried over by Warwick's ships. They numbered only a few thousand. Yet every man knew this campaign would decide not merely who ruled, but what kind of England would survive. Beneath the pale sky of February 1461, they marched eastward, their banners of white roses snapping in the wind. At Mortimer's Cross, near the Welsh marches, their path crossed a Lancastrian force led by Jasper Tudor, uncle to the young Henry Tudor, a name that would one day haunt kings. The morning of battle broke with a strange omen. 3 suns rising through the frost, joined together in a halo of light. The soldiers stared in awe and terror, murmuring prayers. But Edward, tall upon his horse, seized the moment. He turned to his men and declared that the heavens themselves had shown the sign of the Trinity, proof that God favored their cause. The omen burned into the minds of his soldiers, transforming fear into fury. The battle that followed was brutal and close. Tudor's men, veterans hardened by the Welsh hills, struck first. Their charge met a wall of arrows that fell like sleet. Edward fought in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. His armor, splattered with blood, gleamed beneath the winter Sunday. For hours, the snow churned to mud and the cries of the dying echoed across the valley. When it ended, the Lancastrians lay broken, their banners trampled into the thawing ground. Jasper Tudor escaped, but his father, Owen Tudor, once the lover of Queen Catherine of Valois, was captured and executed. The bloodline that had united Lancaster and Wales ended on the block that day. Edward's victory at Mortimer's Cross spread through England like wildfire. To the people, he became more than a noble. He was vengeance made flesh. Young, tall, and impossibly handsome, he embodied what the weary realm longed for: strength, order, and renewal. Warwick joined him soon after, bringing news that London had opened its gates. The Queen's northern army, burdened with loot and fear, had turned back before reaching the capital. For the first time in years, Yorkists held the city and with it, the throne. On March 4th, 1461, in the Great Hall of Westminster, Edward of York was proclaimed King of England. The church bells rang, though their sound carried both triumph and foreboding. Henry VI still lived, wandering somewhere under Margaret's guard, a crowned ghost haunting the realm. And so the war continued, not to seize the crown, but to keep it. The coronation was brief, almost hurried. There was no grand procession, no golden ceremony, only the solemn placing of a crown upon a soldier's head. Yet in that moment, a new kind of monarch was born. Edward IV was not a scholar like Henry, nor a pious man of prayer. He was a warrior king, a creature of the field, his authority carved by steel rather than scripture. Even as London celebrated, Margaret gathered what strength remained to her. The loyal lords of the north rallied to her call. Clifford, Northumberland, Somerset. Her son, the young Prince Edward, watched his mother command men as though born to war. She would march again, not for politics, but for vengeance. The two armies, red and white, moved toward each other through the sleet and mud of early spring, their paths destined to meet on the bleak moors of Yorkshire. The stage was set for Towton, a battle that would stain the snow with more blood than any England had ever seen. The morning of Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461, dawned gray and cruel over the Yorkshire fields. Snow swept across the moorlands like a living thing, sharp, blinding, relentless. There, near the village of Towton, two armies faced one another through the storm, each knowing that by day's end, England itself would be decided. Edward IV, barely 19, stood at the head of his host, 30,000 men in white rose livery. archers from the shires, knights hardened by years of feud. Across the vale, Queen Margaret's army waited, Lancastrians drawn from the north, commanded by the Duke of Somerset, Lord Clifford, and others who had sworn vengeance for St. Albans and Wakefield. Their banners of red roses shuddered in the wind. The storm howled between them, carrying with it the prayers of thousands who knew this day would be their last. Edward's breath misted in the freezing air as he surveyed the field, a wide, open plain hemmed in by marsh and river. There would be no retreat, no mercy. The wind blew from the south, straight into the faces of the Lancastrians. It was their curse. Yorkist archers, standing in long, dark lines, drew their bows and loosed. The first volleys vanished into the storm, then the sound came, like tearing cloth, as shafts found armor and flesh. The Lancastrians tried to answer, but the snow drove their arrows short. Edward's men retrieved them from the ground and sent them back in kind. When the last arrows fell, the field went silent. Then came the sound of trumpets, and the ground began to shake. The armies advanced. Steel met steel in a collision so vast it seemed to shake the very earth. For hours, neither side gave ground. The snow turned crimson, bodies frozen where they fell. The Yorkist line wavered, and Edward himself rode forward, his sword bright in the storm. Witnesses later said he fought like a giant, his massive frame visible through the snow, striking men down one by one, shouting commands that cut through the chaos. Where he rode, his men rallied. Where he struck, the enemy faltered. But the Lancastrians fought with desperation. Clifford and Northumberland hurled their cavalry into the Yorkist flank, nearly breaking it. For a moment, the crown hung in balance until new banners appeared on the horizon. The men of Norfolk, marching under the white rose. They crashed into Somerset's line like a hammer into glass. The battle became slaughter. Driven into the River Cock, the Lancastrians tried to flee, but the bridge collapsed under the press of bodies. Men drowned, clawing at one another for air, their armor dragging them down. The snow that fell over Towton that evening was blackened by smoke and soaked with blood. When night finally came, silence fell upon a field of ghosts. Over 28,000 men were dead, the greatest single day of killing ever recorded on English soil. The moor was littered with the broken emblems of both roses, white and red mingled in the same frozen mud. Edward stood among them, his face pale beneath the streaks of grime and blood. He had won not only a battle, but a kingdom. Yet there was no triumph in his eyes, only exhaustion and the weight of a crown he could never again set down. News of Towton spread faster than the storm itself. In York, the severed heads of Lancastrian lords Somerset, Northumberland, Clifford, were mounted beside the skull of Richard of York, his father. The people whispered that the White Rose had avenged itself at last. Queen Margaret fled north with her son and husband, seeking refuge in Scotland. King Henry VI, frail and bewildered, was found wandering after the battle, praying for the souls of the slain. His prayers went unanswered. The House of Lancaster was broken, and the crown rested firmly in the hands of the young Yorkist king. Edward entered London in triumph that Easter. The bells that tolled for the dead now rang for his coronation. He was crowned in Westminster, the youngest king since Henry V, radiant in youth and victory. The people lined the streets, throwing blossoms of spring white and crimson, both as if the war had never been. To them, he was deliverance, a monarch who had ended years of chaos, restored order, and proven his right by the sword. But the peace that followed Towton was built upon bones. England's nobility had been gutted, families wiped from history, estates left desolate. The feudal order itself had bled out on that field. In its place stood something new, a monarchy that owed its power not to divine right, but to fear. Edward IV ruled as both conqueror and pragmatist. He rewarded loyalty with gold, betrayal with silence, and the noose. His court glittered with wealth-imported silks, wine from Gascony, jewels looted from his enemies. Yet, even amid luxury, the shadow of the war lingered. Every noble smile hid calculation. Every oath of fealty trembled beneath memories of Towton's snow. For Edward, the ghosts never left. In his dreams, the wind still howled over frozen fields, carrying the cries of the dying. He had won everything a man could win, and yet, deep within, he knew peace would not last. For in England, the roses never truly died. They merely waited for spring to bloom again and for blood to feed the roots. The crown of England had never gleamed so bright, nor rested on such uncertain ground. Edward IV, barely 20, entered London not as a prince, but as a conqueror. Behind him, the roads of the north were lined with the dead. Ahead of him stretched a kingdom exhausted by 2 decades of betrayal. He was the first Yorkist king, the embodiment of victory and vengeance. Tall, golden-haired, and radiant with the fire of youth, he was everything Henry VI had never been: decisive, fearless, alive. To his people, he seemed chosen by heaven. To his enemies, he was the proof that God's favor could change hands with the swing of a sword. Edward's first acts as king were swift and calculated. He issued pardons to the common men who had fought for Lancaster peasants, who had bled for their lords. "Let them plow their fields again," he decreed. But the nobles who had stood against him found no mercy. Their lands were confiscated, their sons disinherited. In a single stroke, Edward reshaped England's hierarchy. Families that had ruled for centuries were replaced by new men soldiers of the White Rose, merchants loyal to York, and young nobles whose fortunes had risen in his wars. The age of hereditary right was dying. The age of earned loyalty had begun. At his side, none shone brighter than Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man who had built Edward's throne from ambition and blood. Warwick was everything a medieval magnate could be: rich, powerful, and restless. His estate stretched across half of England, his retainers numbered in the thousands. It was said that when Warwick called his banners, the hills themselves moved. He had brokered alliances, funded armies, and led the charge at Towton. In every way, he had been the maker of kings. For now, he basked in his triumph. The people called him the Kingmaker, a title both glorious and fatal. Warwick dreamed of a stable England ruled through his guidance. Edward, he believed, would listen to reason, to wisdom, to him. But Edward was not a man to be guided. He ruled with the self-assurance of youth and the hunger of a conqueror. He reveled in ceremony, in the trappings of kingship, not as divine duty, but as theater. His court glittered with feasts and tournaments, a pageant of wealth unmatched since the days of Edward III. Beneath the banners and banquets, however, the realm still trembled. Lancastrian strongholds remained in Wales and the north, where Queen Margaret and her exiled followers plotted from Scottish refuge. Edward's generals swept across those regions in brutal campaigns, crushing resistance, hanging rebels, and burning villages that refused to yield. When the last Lancastrian fortress fell, its banners torn down and replaced by the White Rose, England exhaled. For the first time in decades, there was peace. But peace had a price. With the wars over, Edward turned to ruling and to pleasure. He was not a scholar like Henry VI, nor a monkish reformer. He was a soldier who loved life too much to abstain from its excess. Wine, laughter, hunting, women, all became the king's companions. He moved through his palaces like a sun among stars, leaving those around him half blinded by his charm. Warwick watched uneasily. He had built Edward's power on discipline and duty, not indulgence. Now the king surrounded himself with courtiers, young men of lesser birth, flatterers who owed their titles to royal favor, not blood. In this glittering court, ambition festered anew. Old nobles muttered that Edward's family, the Woodvilles and the Nevilles, grew too rich. Merchants whispered that the crown's debts deepened even as trade revived. And through it all, Edward smiled, confident that strength would silence discontent. In 1464, that confidence would betray him. For years, Warwick had negotiated with France for Edward's marriage, a political union meant to secure peace and gold. But when the king announced he was already married, the realm gasped. His bride was Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner of minor nobility, beautiful, ambitious, and entirely unsuitable for a king. He had met her in secret, some said under an oak in the countryside, and married her without counsel or permission. To Warwick, it was an unforgivable insult, his years of planning undone by a moment of passion. To the nobles, it was proof that Edward's blood was too hot, his crown too light. The court split in murmurs. Elizabeth's large family was swiftly elevated, her brothers given lands, her sisters married to powerful lords. The Woodvilles became a dynasty overnight, their emblem entwined with the white rose. But in the shadows, Warwick's patience curdled into resentment. He had made a king who no longer listened, a ruler who thought himself invincible. And as the White King basked in his glory, the first cracks in his kingdom began to spread. Outside the gilded halls, the old world stirred. Lancastrian remnants gathered again in the north, spurred by whispers that Henry VI still lived. Peasants spoke of omens of storms that rolled over empty battlefields, of crows nesting on forgotten graves. For all his beauty and brilliance, Edward could not hear it, the quiet sound of destiny turning once more. The roses were not done with England. They had only changed color. The glitter of the White King's court soon turned to glass bright, fragile, and full of cracks. What began as triumph had become tension, and beneath the feasts and pageants, England's nobility whispered of betrayal. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once the architect of Edward's glory, now found himself sidelined, his counsel dismissed, his pride wounded. He had believed the new king would rule by his wisdom. Instead, Edward ruled by impulse, young, defiant, and increasingly consumed by his own sense of destiny. The Woodvilles, Edward's new in-laws, tightened their grip on power. Their rise was meteoric and shameless. Elizabeth Woodville's father was made Earl Rivers, her brothers given high offices, her sisters wed into ancient families that had once stood above them. To Warwick and the old nobility, it was heresy not of faith, but of order. For centuries, England's hierarchy had been bound by lineage. Now, a king's love had torn it apart. Warwick's resentment grew, but he did not act in haste. He watched, waited, and gathered allies in the north, where his name still carried the weight of loyalty. In council, he smiled and bowed. In his heart, he planned rebellion. England's peace was fragile. The wounds of Towton had not healed, and the countryside still bled from famine and war taxes. The merchant guilds grumbled at the crown's debts, and soldiers returned home unpaid. Whispers began to drift through taverns and churches alike that the White King was too proud, that the kingmaker had been cast aside, and that God's favor was shifting again. In the spring of 1469, Warwick moved. The rebellion began not with armies, but with words, forged letters bearing the king's name, calling for local uprisings in the north. Men rose in Yorkshire, crying for justice against the evil councillors who surrounded Edward. When the king sent troops to suppress them, he found himself outmaneuvered. The rebels were not rabble, they were organized, armed, and led by Warwick's captains. Edward's royal force marched north to meet them, confident, careless, unaware that the trap was already set. At Edgecote Moor, the two sides clashed in a storm of confusion and treachery. The Yorkist army, cut off from reinforcements, was surrounded. The king's favorite, the Earl of Pembroke, was taken and executed. When Edward himself rode into the north to restore order, he was seized by Warwick's men. For the first time in English history, a king of York was taken prisoner by the man who had once made him. Warwick brought Edward to Warwick Castle not as a captive in chains, but as a trophy. He hoped to rule through him once more, to restore his influence under the guise of loyalty. But the plan faltered. Edward refused to yield. Even in confinement, he remained composed, courteous, dangerous. Warwick had forgotten one truth. A crown, once worn, cannot be shared. The nobles wavered. Without Edward's royal sanction, no edicts could be enforced, no taxes collected, no justice declared. England slid toward anarchy again. Riots broke out in London. Merchants closed their shops. The people muttered that God punished those who defied the rightful king. By autumn, Warwick had no choice but to release him. Edward returned to London in triumph, his composure intact, his vengeance carefully sheathed. He embraced Warwick publicly, thanked him for his service, and smiled a smile that froze even his enemies. Behind that smile, the White King began to plan his revenge. For a brief season, peace returned, but beneath the surface, the game had changed forever. Edward could no longer trust the man who had built his throne. Warwick, knowing this, turned his eyes elsewhere across the sea. In France, King Louis XI waited patiently, ever eager to meddle in England's troubles. He saw in Warwick a weapon, one forged by pride and betrayal. Through secret envoys, the two men conspired. If Warwick could no longer control Edward, he would replace him, and for that he needed the unlikeliest of allies, Queen Margaret of Anjou, the same woman he had once fought to destroy. The irony was divine. Warwick, the kingmaker of York, would now become the savior of Lancaster. He sailed to France in 1470, meeting the exiled queen face to face. Two enemies joined hands: the proud earl who had dethroned her husband, and the furious queen who had lost everything. Louis smiled upon them both, his treasury open, his blessing given. In that moment, the next act of England's tragedy was set. As Warwick and Margaret plotted in exile, Edward ruled a kingdom filled with false calm. He hunted in the forests of Windsor, hosted grand feasts, and laughed with his courtiers as though nothing could touch him. But he knew, in the nights that followed, he could feel the chill of fate creeping closer, the same chill that had taken his father, his enemies, and his friends alike. By the year's end, word came like thunder. Warwick had landed in England. His banner, once white with the rose of York, now flew crimson with the red rose of Lancaster. The people of the north rose to greet him. Castles opened their gates. Lancastrian exiles flooded back across the Channel, shouting the Queen's name. In London, panic spread. Edward's army was scattered. His supporters wavered. Within weeks, he was forced to flee, his crown abandoned, his family taken. The White King, who had risen from the ashes of Towton, now found himself a fugitive. He escaped across the North Sea to Burgundy with only a handful of loyal men. Behind him, the kingmaker restored the past, returning Henry VI to the throne, pale and bewildered, a ghost wearing a crown. But England had changed since the days of the sleeping king. The red rose that Warwick revived would not bloom for long. The age of chivalry was dying, and the age of betrayal had begun. Winter pressed hard upon the shores of Burgundy when a small English ship slipped into port beneath a pale Sunday. Its sails were torn, its crew hollow-eyed, and among them stood a man who had once worn a crown. Edward of York, King Edward IV, had fled his own kingdom, his throne stolen, his brother Clarence turned traitor, and his friends scattered to the wind. He was no longer a monarch, but an exile, cold and hunted, bearing only his name and his defiance. The storm that had driven him from England was not of weather, but of men. Warwick the kingmaker now ruled in his stead, a puppet master resurrecting old ghosts. At his side, the long-banished Queen Margaret of Anjou prepared to restore her husband, Henry VI, to the throne, the same king whom Warwick's sword had once cast down. England, once bright beneath the white rose, now bled again under banners of red. But across the Channel, Edward was not broken. He was a soldier before he was a king, and exile did not strip him of that truth. In the candlelight of a Burgundian fortress, he began to plan his return quietly, methodically, with the same cold certainty that had once won him Towton. He found in Duke Charles of Burgundy not just a kinsman, but an opportunity. Charles, married to Edward's sister Margaret, was wary of entangling himself in England's chaos. Yet, he understood power and he understood revenge. Through gifts of gold and a promise of trade, Edward secured ships, men, and arms. By March of 1471, the exiled king set sail once more not as a conqueror, but as a gambler, placing his final stake upon destiny. His fleet landed on the Yorkshire coast. The sea mist was thick, the wind cruel, but the white banners of York fluttered once again above English soil. At first, only a few hundred men followed him, merchants, exiles, and loyal knights who had lost everything but faith. Yet, as Edward marched south, the tide began to turn. He moved swiftly, avoiding pitched battle, speaking little but acting with precision. At every village, he declared that he had come not as invader, but as rightful king, seeking only the peace of England. The people, weary of blood and deceit, began to rally. Old veterans of Towton returned to his ranks, their armor rusted but their loyalty unshaken. By the time he reached Nottingham, Edward's army had swelled to thousands. His younger brother, Richard of Gloucester, joined him, silent, devoted, and sharp as steel. Together, they marched for London. In the capital, Warwick's regime began to tremble. The restored King Henry VI sat upon the throne like a ghost, thin, pale, and utterly detached from the realm that tore itself apart around him. He prayed for peace while his ministers schemed and his soldiers deserted. Even Warwick, for all his might, felt the tide shifting beneath him. For years, he had believed himself the hand that shaped England. Now, as Edward advanced like a storm from the north, the hand began to tremble. At Coventry, the two armies neared each other, York and Lancaster, once again facing the reckoning of their own making. But Warwick hesitated. Edward, always cunning, sent word to Clarence, the brother who had betrayed him, now wavering between guilt and ambition. The message was simple: come back to your blood, or perish with your pride. And Clarence, forever swayed by fortune, chose blood. When he rode into Edward's camp, the king greeted him not with words but with open arms. In that embrace, the war turned. For the first time in years, the House of York stood united, if only for a moment. With Clarence restored, Edward's rank surged. He marched on London before Warwick could intercept him. The gates of the city opened without resistance. The people remembered the White King, his fair rule, his laughter, his victories, and welcomed him as though death itself had been defeated. Inside the Tower of London, Henry VI was seized once more, quietly, without ceremony. He did not resist. He merely bowed his head and murmured a prayer. For a brief moment, the two kings, one living, one already fading, shared the same walls again. Edward had reclaimed his capital. Now he turned his gaze to the north, where the kingmaker waited. Warwick gathered his army near Barnet, disciplined, vast, and confident. His banners bore the badge of the bear and ragged staff, the symbol that had once commanded England's fate. Yet behind that pride lurked exhaustion. He had spent his life making kings. Now he must kill one. At dawn on Easter Sunday, 1471, the armies met in a fog so thick that men could barely see their own banners. Arrows hissed unseen. Horses crashed into lines of pikes. The air filled with the roar of battle and the screams of the dying. Edward rode at the center, his armor gleaming silver in the dim light, a vision of relentless will. He fought not only for a throne, but for survival. Warwick, commanding from the ridge, believed victory was his. But the mist betrayed him. His own men, disoriented, mistook his allies for enemies and turned their blades upon them. Confusion spread like wildfire. Seizing the moment, Edward led a brutal charge straight through the Lancastrian center. The white rose cut through red as dawn broke above the field, a sun rising over ruin. When the fog finally lifted, Warwick's banners were scattered. The kingmaker lay among the fallen, pierced through with a soldier's spear. He had built a dozen crowns and destroyed as many lives. Now, in death, His legend ended as all ambitions do, with silence. Edward stood over the field at Barnet, blood and smoke around him. He looked upon the body of the man who had once been his ally, his enemy, and his maker. There was no triumph in his eyes, only understanding. For in Warwick's fall, he saw his own reflection, the truth that every crown rests on borrowed loyalty, and every victory is temporary. The war, however, was not yet done. For even as the fog cleared at Barnet, far to the south, Queen Margaret landed in England once more, her son, Prince Edward, beside her, vengeance burning bright in her heart. And the red rose would bloom again, one final time, in the fields of Tewkesbury. The morning after Barnet was grey and still. Crows gathered over the fallen, their cries the only anthem left for the dead. The fog that had cloaked the battle drifted away, revealing what England had become, a kingdom stitched together with corpses and ambition. Edward IV rode among the ruins. The field was littered with banners of both roses, trampled into the same mud. Somewhere beneath the silence lay Warwick, the man who had made him king, and nearly unmade the world to do it. Edward ordered that Warwick and his brother Montague be buried with honor. Even kings knew respect for the ghost that built their thrones. But his mercy was not peace. It was prelude. For even as the White King restored his crown, across the western sea another tide was rising. Queen Margaret of Anjou had landed in England. After years of exile, the red rose bloomed once more, fierce, desperate, and burning for revenge. She came ashore at Weymouth with her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, the last hope of Lancaster. Around her gathered those who still believed the realm could be restored to Henry VI, Jasper Tudor, the Earl of Devon, and remnants of the northern lords who refused to bow. The timing was cruel. When news reached her that Warwick had fallen at Barnet, she is said to have collapsed, the strength leaving her body. Her greatest ally, the architect of her return, was gone. But Margaret was her husband's opposite. Where Henry prayed, she acted. She rose again and turned her sorrow into iron. From the ports of the west, she marched inland, gathering support as she went. Devon, Somerset, and the loyal men of Wales rallied to her banners. The red rose, battered and bleeding, refused to die. Edward, swift as ever, moved to intercept her. He marched his army south from London, his brothers Clarence and Richard of Gloucester by his side. The king's pace was relentless, 30 miles a day. Mud or rain be damned. He would not give Margaret time to reach the safety of Wales or to unite with Jasper Tudor's reinforcements. The two forces met near Tewkesbury, a quiet town by the River Severn. There, on the morning of the 4th of May 1471, the War of the Roses reached its most tragic hour. The sun rose over fields of wheat, still green with spring. To the north stood the Lancastrians, their banners heavy with damp air. Their ranks spread along a low ridge. To the south came Edward's army, gleaming like a blade, disciplined, seasoned, and hungering for final victory. Edward himself commanded the center, his white lion crest visible through the haze. Clarence held the left, seeking redemption for his betrayal. Richard, young but already deadly, led the right. Trumpets sounded, and once more, Englishmen turned their swords upon Englishmen. The first clash was thunder, a brutal melee of spears and steel. Lancastrian archers loosed volleys that darkened the sky, but Edward's men advanced behind walls of shields, driving upward into the red lines. When arrows ran dry, the fight became hand-to-hand pike-meeting armor, mud swallowing the wounded. Somerset, commanding the Lancastrian right, tried to outflank Edward through a hidden lane, but he found only disaster. Gloucester's men vervating. The trap snapped shut, and hundreds of Lancastrians were cut down in the narrow ditch that would forever be called Bloody Meadow. Across the ridge, Margaret's forces began to break. The young prince, Edward of Westminster, barely 17, fought among his men, reckless, brave, and doomed. He had been raised in exile to reclaim his father's crown. Now he faced the cold truth of English steel. When the rout began, he was captured amid the chaos. By dusk, The red banners had fallen. The last army of Lancaster was no more. Queen Margaret, once the most feared woman in England, was taken prisoner. Her son, the only heir of Henry VI, was dead. The chroniclers would never agree how it happened. Some said he was struck down in battle. Others whispered darker tales that he was slain after capture, silent beneath the gaze of the Yorkist brothers. Whatever the truth, the bloodline of Lancaster ended at Tewkesbury. Night fell heavy upon the field. Edward rode through the campfires, the weight of years in his eyes. He had won everything, his crown, his vengeance, his kingdom, but he could not wash the mud of civil war from his soul. The land itself seemed tired of kings. In the following days, the victors showed no mercy. The Lancastrian lords taken at Tewkesbury were dragged to the abbey, tried in haste, and executed. The bells of the church tolled for their deaths, echoing through the valleys like a dirge for England's honor. Edward's march back to London was triumphant, a parade of banners reclaimed and enemies subdued. Behind him, Queen Margaret rode in silence, her face pale beneath a widow's veil. Ahead of them, the Tower awaited. There, in the heart of the kingdom, King Henry VI remained imprisoned, frail, broken, a relic of another world. On the night of the 21st of May 1471, he died in his cell. The official records spoke of grief and divine will, but London whispered a different truth, that he had been murdered quietly by royal order to ensure the Red Rose would never rise again. When dawn broke over the Thames, England belonged once more to Edward IV. He had destroyed his enemies root and branch. The House of Lancaster was extinguished. Peace, or something like it, returned. But beneath the victory, another shadow stirred. His brothers Clarence and Gloucester had fought beside him, yet each carried within him a hunger of his own. And from the ashes of Tewkesbury, a new struggle began, not for England, but for the soul of the House of York itself. The war was over, or so England believed. For the first time in 30 years, no banners flew against the crown. The red rose had withered in the mud at Tewkesbury, and the white rose of York shone unchallenged upon the throne. Yet victory, like wine left too long in the sun, soon turned sour. King Edward IV ruled a kingdom reborn, but peace did not suit him as war once had. He was only 29, strong, golden-haired, and adored. London called him the handsomest man alive. He had restored order, reopened the ports, and filled the treasuries again with silver taken from Calais and trade. But the peace he built was gilded beneath the splendor. His own house began to crack. His court was a theater of silk and shadows. Feasts lasted for days, tapestries glittered with gold thread, and minstrels sang of Yorkist glory. Yet every toast, every smile, masked the same unspoken truth. Edward's family had won the crown together, but each of them wanted it for himself. The first fracture came from blood. George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's younger brother, had been loyal once. He had fought at Tewkesbury, ridden beside his king, and sworn that the blood of York would stand united forever. But envy grew quickly in men who lived too long in another's shadow. Edward rewarded Clarence with wealth, lands, and favor, but none of it filled the emptiness in him. He had once betrayed his brother to Warwick's rebellion, and though Edward had forgiven him, Clarence could not forgive himself. He lived haunted by the fear that forgiveness was only a weapon waiting to be used. And then there was Richard, the youngest brother. Small, pale, and thoughtful, he was everything Edward was not. Where Edward ruled with charm, Richard ruled with silence. Where Clarence dreamed of crowns, Richard studied men. He had fought ruthlessly at Barnet and Tewkesbury, and the blood of battle had shaped him into something cold and precise. He watched, he remembered, and he never forgot who stood where when the swords were drawn. For now, Edward stood above them both, magnificent, charismatic, untouchable. But he began to live as though his victories would never fade. He grew heavier, softer, surrounded by flatterers and women who whispered only what pleased him. His queen, Elizabeth Woodville, once his great scandal, now wielded quiet power through her family, a new nobility born not of ancient blood, but of royal marriage. The old lords of England, Warwick's ghosts, Salisbury's kin, even the Nevilles who had survived, looked upon the Woodvilles with contempt. To them, the king's court was being turned into a market, where lands and titles were sold for favors and kinship rather than valor. Clarence found in that resentment a mirror for his own bitterness. He began to whisper. In the taverns of London, rumors spread that the king was illegitimate, that Edward had not truly been born of York blood, but of another man's bed. Clarence's hand was unseen, but his voice carried. He claimed prophecies spoke of his destiny of the letter G that would destroy the sons of York. Edward laughed at first. He had weathered rebellions before. But the laughter stopped when he learned that Clarence had defied royal orders and arranged the execution of one of the Queen's men, a false witch accused of cursing his wife. The act was small, yet in it lay rebellion. Clarence was summoned to court, his brother's patience burned away. The trial was swift, though not public. The sentence, death by royal command, was sealed with wax and sorrow. The manner of his end became legend, that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, the same drink he had once toasted in victory. Whether true or not, it was a fitting death for a man who had drowned himself long before in envy, in fear, in his own reflection. Edward grieved in private. To others he appeared unmoved, but those close to him saw the toll. The laughter that had filled his court began to dim. He had killed his brother not by sword, but by necessity. And necessity, he learned, was colder than war. As the years turned, the king's body changed with them. He grew fat, breathless, his face flushed from indulgence, hunting, feasting, women, wine. The pleasures that once made him seem invincible now hollowed him from within. He had become a lion too, used to the cage. But Richard, the youngest, never forgot. He had seen his brother Clarence destroyed not by fate, but by the quiet machinery of power. He had learned what peace truly was, another kind of battlefield, where loyalty was a blade used in silence. Richard governed the north in the king's name, ruling from York and Middleham with the discipline of a soldier and the piety of a man who saw sin in every weakness. The people loved him. They called him Good King Richard, though he was not yet king. He hunted down bandits, settled disputes, rebuilt walls along the border. He wrote letters to London filled with obedience and duty. Yet beneath the calm ink, another story grew, one of a man who believed destiny would someday call him to restore the honor that others had corrupted. By 1482, the realm was weary. Edward's eldest son, the young Prince Edward of Wales, was being raised as the symbol of York's future. But even that future felt uncertain. The court was divided between the Woodvilles and the Old Guard, each scheming for control of the boy who would inherit everything. And Edward himself, only 40 years old, began to falter. His heart, strained by years of indulgence, betrayed him. In the spring of 1483, he took to his bed, feverish and pale, haunted by memories of all he had conquered and all he had lost. He asked for his sons, for his queen, for his brothers, but one was dead and the other far away. He prayed, not to be forgiven, but to be remembered. When he died that April, the bells of London tolled for the last great Yorkist king. The people wept, for despite his flaws, Edward had been a ruler of flesh and fire, the first in a generation to bring peace through strength. But as his body was carried through the streets toward Windsor, another shadow followed. His heir was only 12, and in the silence left by a dead king, the living began to move their pieces. Richard of Gloucester, the loyal brother, the quiet soldier, was returning to London. The death of King Edward IV fell upon England like a thunderclap in spring, sudden, unprepared, and heavy with the scent of rain that never came. The White King was gone, leaving behind 2 sons too young to rule, a widow too ambitious to yield, and a brother too loyal or too cunning to wait. London draped itself in black. Bells tolled through the fog that rolled over the Thames, their echoes fading among towers and taverns. Yet even as the morning began, the struggle for the kingdom had already started. The dead king's eldest son, Prince Edward of Wales, was 12 years old, bright, educated, and adored by his father's court. He was proclaimed king in name only, Edward V, heir to the House of York. But in truth, the boy was a crown without a sword. His mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, sought to guard him behind the walls of her family's power, while the great lords, distrustful of the Woodvilles, turned their eyes toward one man, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. For years, Richard had ruled the north with discipline and quiet faith. He had never challenged his brother, never reached for more than duty required. Now, in the vacuum left by Edward's death, the council named him Lord Protector of the Realm. It was the same title once given to Richard of York, decades before, and England had not forgotten how that story ended. When word reached Richard in York that his brother was dead, he wept, or so the chronicles said, but his grief soon hardened into resolve. He gathered his men and rode south to protect his nephew on his journey to London. Along the road, he met the boy's escort, a Woodville uncle, leading the royal party toward the capital. What happened next was cloaked in ceremony, but sharp beneath the velvet. The protector informed the royal uncle that he would take charge of the prince's safety. The uncle protested. He was arrested. By the time they reached London, the tone of the kingdom had changed. The new king and his protector entered the city side by side, the child smiling. Unaware, the uncle vanished into custody. The queen, upon hearing of this, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, with her younger son, Prince Richard of York, refusing to emerge. The sound of bells still mourning her husband now told for her fear. For a time, London stood suspended, half in grief, half in dread. Richard moved quietly through the council chambers, calm, deliberate, impossible to read. He assured all that his only wish was the young king's safety until the coronation. The date was set for June, but June never came. Whispers began to ripple through the court. Whispers of illegitimacy, of secret marriages, of broken vows long buried. A priest emerged, claiming that King Edward IV had once been betrothed to another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, rendering all his children bastards in the eyes of God. The claim was shocking, convenient, and devastating. In the space of weeks, the council declared that Edward's sons could not inherit the throne. The crown, by divine right and lawful succession, now fell to the protector himself. Thus, in the summer of 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became King Richard III. He took the crown in Westminster Abbey, the air thick with incense and unease. The people cheered, because they always did, but their cheers sounded thin, like metal striking stone. In the Tower of London, two small boys watched the sunset behind iron bars. Edward V, the uncrowned king, and his brother Richard were lodged there for their safety. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens, laughing from the battlements. Then, less often, then not at all. By autumn, they had vanished. No body was found, no confession made, but the silence was louder than any proof. London streets murmured that the boys were dead, smothered in their sleep, buried in secret, their innocence traded for the security of a crown. The story would outlive every chronicler who tried to explain it. Some said it was the work of ambitious courtiers, others the king himself. But the truth, like the tower stone, endured unspoken. Richard ruled with iron precision. He was not a man of luxury like his brother had been. He rose before dawn, read petitions, dispensed justice, and personally inspected the forts of the north. He spoke often of order and duty, of peace restored after chaos. Yet wherever he went, people bowed too deeply, too long, as if afraid to meet his eyes. His reign was short, but its shadow was long. In a single year, the realm's faith in Yorkist destiny dissolved. Foreign envoys watched with caution. Discontent smoldered in the shires. And across the Channel, in the exiled court of Brittany, another claimant stirred a young man of Welsh blood named Henry Tudor, whose mother claimed descent from the House of Lancaster. He watched from afar, biding his time, as England once again prepared to drown in its own blood. Richard, though feared, was not yet hated. His reforms in law were praised. He punished corruption, curbed extortion, and ensured the poor could petition the crown directly. Yet the rumors never stopped. Every sermon, every tavern song, every whisper in the market returned to the same question: what happened to the princes? No king could outrun such ghosts. By 1485, rebellion had become prophecy. Henry Tudor crossed the sea with French ships and English exiles. Richard gathered his army to meet him at Bosworth Field. The War of Brothers was not over. It had only changed names. York had devoured Lancaster. Now Lancaster rose again to devour York. And on that August morning, under clouds heavy with centuries of vengeance, Richard rode into battle, the last Plantagenet king, armored in guilt and glory, crying that he would trade his kingdom for a horse before ever yielding his crown. The Tower of London had always been a place of power, a fortress, a palace, a prison. But in the summer of 1483, it became something else entirely. It became a tomb without a name. 2 boys lived there, or so London believed. The elder, Edward V, once destined to be king. The younger, Richard of York, barely 10. They were the last pure heirs of the House of York, born of a dynasty that had won England through rivers of blood. Now, behind stone walls, they vanished into whispers. Outside the tower, the kingdom pretended to breathe easily. King Richard III, newly crowned, spoke of reform, of justice, of divine order restored. He reduced taxes, punished thieves, restored lands unfairly taken during Edward IV's indulgent rule. He rode among the people, spoke with merchants, and dined with soldiers. To the public eye, he was everything a ruler should be: decisive, moral, uncorrupted. But power in England had never rested on virtue. It rested on fear, and on what could be believed when proof was gone. In London's taverns, talk slithered like smoke. Some swore the princes had been moved to safety, hidden far in the countryside. Others whispered of screams in the night, muffled beneath the stones of the tower. The city could not decide whether its new king was savior or usurper. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, remained cloistered in sanctuary at Westminster. Her faith turned brittle with grief. The walls that had once protected her children now seemed to mock her. She had lost her husband, her crown, and now perhaps her sons. Every toll of the cathedral bells felt like a funeral she could not attend. Richard said nothing. No decree, no denial, no confession. He ruled as if silence itself could hold back judgment. But silence breeds monsters, and soon the rumors became legend. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor listened. In exile since boyhood, the descendant of a bastard line had grown into a careful, calculating man. He watched as Richard's legitimacy crumbled under the weight of suspicion. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, whispered in secret to those still loyal to the Red Rose. She saw what few dared to the chance for Lancaster to rise again through her son. In 1484, as England's harvest failed and taxes rose to maintain the king's fortifications, rebellion stirred, first in the south, then in Wales, and finally in the hearts of those who had once sworn oaths to York. Many of them were no longer certain who they served, the crown or their own survival. Among them was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's closest ally. He had helped the king seize power. Now he turned against him. Whether out of conscience or ambition, no one could say. But Buckingham's rebellion came and died, like a spark in the rain, crushed before it could spread. He was captured and executed in the marketplace of Salisbury, his head raised as a warning. Richard's reign endured, but it did not heal. Every victory only deepened his isolation. His queen, Anne Neville, daughter of the kingmaker Warwick, grew sickly. Their only son, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly, leaving Richard heirless. When Anne followed him to the grave soon after, the king walked in black through his silent court, surrounded by banners that no longer meant triumph. He was only 32, yet the years of suspicion, war, and loss had carved him into something unrecognizable, a man who had climbed to the throne over the graves of his brothers and nephews, and now ruled alone. Still, he did not falter. In 1485, when word came that Henry Tudor had landed in Wales with a foreign army, Richard gathered his strength like a storm reawakening. He rode north to summon his retainers, calling every loyal house to his banner. His letters burned with pride. He would meet the invader head-on, as a true English king. But the lords who answered his summons were fewer than before. Some delayed, others promised aid and sent none. A few secretly had already sworn allegiance to Henry. The realm was tired of roses, tired of brothers killing brothers for crowns that brought no peace. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, advanced through Wales with an army half French, half Welsh, a tide of exiles, mercenaries, and dreamers who believed themselves part of prophecy. The old legend spoke of a Mab Darrigan, a chosen son who would unite the land and bring peace to Britain once more. In Henry, they saw that promise reborn. As he marched east, his forces swelled. The Red Dragon of Cadwallader flew beside the banner of the Red Rose. Wales and Lancaster joined at last. Richard met him at Bosworth Field, near Market Bosworth, on the morning of the 22nd of August, 1485. The sky was low, the ground slick with dew and memory. It had been 30 years since the first blood at St. Albans, and still the roses bled. The Yorkist army was larger, stronger, its knights glittering in full plate. But strength alone had never saved kings. Richard's allies, the powerful Stanley family, stood apart, their men waiting in silence, watching the two forces prepare. The king saw it and understood. He had trusted no one for years. Now, at the hour of destiny, he realized he had no one left to trust. He rode to his men, lifted his sword, and spoke the only words history would remember. "This day I will die as a king, or live as none." The horns sounded. The armies charged. England's last medieval battle had begun. The morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, dawned gray and heavy, as though the heavens themselves had grown weary of England's endless war. Mist clung to the shallow hills of Bosworth Field, veiling two armies that faced one another across the wet grass, the last heirs of Lancaster and York. At one end stood King Richard III, the last Plantagenet. His armor was polished silver and scarlet, his crown fixed above his helmet, the symbol of a king who ruled not by consent, but by will. His standard bore the white boar, teeth bared, ready to charge. Around him stood his dwindling host, a few thousand men, hardened by years of betrayal and battle fatigue. Across the field waited Henry Tudor, thin and pale, wearing no crown, no royal armor. His claim was frail, his army smaller, a gathering of Welsh archers, French mercenaries, and desperate Englishmen who dreamed that perhaps, this time, the blood would end. They carried the banner of the Red Dragon and the Red Rose, old symbols, now repainted with new hope. Between them stood Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother William, their men silent and still, watching. They had sworn allegiance to Richard, but their hearts and their future were not so easily sworn. The trumpet's cry shattered the stillness. The two armies moved. Richard's vanguard thundered forward, knights in plate, lances leveled, the ground shaking beneath them. Arrows hissed across the air. The French guns roared from Tudor's line. Men fell before they could draw swords, crushed by the weight of war itself. The king's horse cut through the mud like a blade through flesh. He drove his men straight into Tudor's flank, scattering mercenaries, splitting shields. The Red Dragon faltered, and for a moment it seemed that the white rose would bloom again in blood. But Henry's men did not break. Behind him, John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, held firm, rallying the lines. His soldiers fought not for heritage, but for a promise that England could be more than this endless circle of death and crowns. Richard saw Henry across the chaos, a small figure on the ridge behind his standard-bearer. For one blazing instant, the king's instincts, honed through years of betrayal, told him the truth. The battle would not be won by numbers or courage, but by killing that one man. He spurred his horse and charged alone into the storm. The royal standard of Richard III surged forward like a falling star. He cut through the guards surrounding Henry with furious precision, his sword flashing, his crown gleaming under the gray sky. 2 men fell, then 3. For that heartbeat of history, England's fate balanced on the tip of his blade. But then the Stanleys moved. Their banners turned, not toward Richard's flank to aid him, but against him. The air filled with the thunder of betrayal, thousands of fresh troops descending upon the king from behind. Richard realized what had happened too late. Surrounded, his white boar standard buckled. His horse, pierced by pikes, collapsed beneath him. Yet he rose from the mud, bloodied but unbroken. The chronicles would later write that he fought bravely in the thickest press, seeking only Henry Tudor himself. He killed the standard-bearer, struck down 2 knights, and nearly reached Henry's side before he was swallowed by the tide. A sword cut through his helm, another pierced his chest, and the last Plantagenet fell. When the fighting ended, the field was a graveyard. Bodies lay in heaps, armor twisted, banners torn. The red dragon and red rose stood above them all, fluttering together for the first time. Richard's corpse was stripped, slung naked across a horse, and carried to Leicester, his head lolling, his crown gone. The people who once called him king now stared in silence as the body passed, caked in blood and mud, still wearing a faint expression of defiance. He was buried without ceremony beneath the floor of a friary church, forgotten, unmarked, as though his reign had been only a bad dream England wished to erase. In the days that followed, Henry Tudor entered London not as a conqueror, but as a ghost stepping into destiny. The nobles came crawling, swearing loyalty anew, their banners folded into the red rose. He declared himself Henry VII, king by right of conquest and by the will of God. To strengthen that claim, he swore to marry Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, the union of red and white, Lancaster and York. The War of the Roses was over, but its scars would never fade. In quiet corners of England, people still whispered of the princes, the boys who vanished in the Tower. Some said their ghosts walked the corridors at night, pale and lost. Others said they had escaped, that one day they would return to reclaim their birthright. But the truth, like the stones of the Tower itself, remained silent. Henry VII ordered no search, no inquest. The story of the princes became a wound that no one dared touch. He ruled instead by building something new, a kingdom that feared war more than tyranny. Taxes filled the coffers. Trade grew. The country began to heal. But even peace carries a shadow. Every time Henry looked upon his own sons, Arthur and Henry, he saw the price that had been paid for the crown. The blood of York still pulsed in their veins. His throne stood only because Richard's line had died in the dark. And so England entered a new age, not of knights and banners, but of diplomacy, fear, and quiet iron. The Tudors had risen from the ashes of both roses, but the roots of their power were still watered with blood. As years passed, the name Richard III became legend, twisted by rumor and rewritten by victors. To some, he was a murderer, a tyrant, a deformed usurper who killed his nephews for the throne. To others, he was a fallen warrior, betrayed by his own kin, crushed by fate. Centuries later, when his bones were unearthed beneath a parking lot in Leicester, historians and poets alike would whisper the same question. Was he villain or victim? The answer lies buried, like the roses that once bled across England's fields. The fields of Bosworth were silent now. The carrion birds had done their work. The banners had rotted where they fell. Yet, in that silence, a new age began. The war that had devoured England for 30 years was over, at least for the moment. From the bloodied mud of the Midlands rose a new king, Henry Tudor, a man who had never expected to sit upon a throne. His crown was not forged by lineage, but by survival. In London, they called him Henry VII, the first monarch of a new house. The Tudors, who claimed descent from both roses, the white of York and the red of Lancaster, would at last be joined in peace. But peace is rarely born from victory. It is born from exhaustion. England in 1485 was a nation hollowed by decades of civil war. Its fields had gone untended. Its noble houses were half empty, their heirs buried in foreign mud or English marsh. Villages stood in ruins, their names forgotten. The church held more gold than the crown, and the merchants of London whispered that faith had replaced the king as England's true ruler. Into this fragile world walked Henry, cautious, reserved, haunted by exile. He had spent half his life in Brittany and France, a wanderer without a home. His claim to the throne a candle flickering in foreign courts. Now, that candle burned with the light of destiny. But even as London cheered his entry, the whispers began. Was he truly England's king? He had defeated Richard, yes, but victory on the battlefield was not lineage. The blood of the Plantagenets still flowed through others, hidden in monasteries and foreign courts. Henry knew this better than anyone, for he too had worn the hunted crown once, and he knew that crowns could fall as easily as they were placed. To secure his reign, Henry turned to the one person who could silence doubt: Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, sister of the lost princes, the last living symbol of the white rose. Their marriage, arranged in the winter of 1486, was not born of love but necessity. Yet when she entered Westminster Abbey in gold and crimson, the people saw more than a bride. They saw the two roses, long enemies, entwined at last. The union became legend before the vows were even spoken. For a brief, trembling moment, England believed again. The poets called it the wedding that ended a war. Bells rang across London. Sermons proclaimed divine reconciliation. The royal standard was remade. The red and white roses fused into one bloom, the Tudor rose. But beneath the silks and hymns, the shadows of the past still moved. Many of Henry's courtiers had once knelt before Richard. Others still whispered the names of Yorkist heirs. In the taverns, men toasted the return of the rightful king, meaning not Henry, but someone else. And somewhere across the narrow sea, others listened. One of them was John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, nephew of Edward IV, cousin to the vanished princes, and once named heir by Richard III himself. To him, Henry was no savior, merely a usurper who wore borrowed blood. Lincoln began to write letters in cipher. To Burgundy, to Ireland, to Yorkist exiles still hungry for vengeance. The Plantagenet flame had not gone out, it only waited for breath. Meanwhile, Henry ruled with the caution of a man who trusted no one, not even his own blood. He surrounded himself with clerks and accountants rather than knights. Gold, not steel, became his weapon. Every noble family that had once bled for the roses now found itself under watch, their estates audited, their loyalties priced like merchandise. The new king did not ride into battle. He built walls of law and coin. He understood something. His forebears never had that power. Once stained by blood, must be bound by numbers. Still, the people yearned for spectacle. They remembered Edward IV's pageantry, his charisma, his feasts. Henry offered none of it. His court was silent, his manner severe, his smile thin. He trusted only his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a woman as devout as she was ambitious. Her prayers shaped his policy, her discipline, his throne. Together they built the Tudor legacy, not with swords, but with silence. Yet silence could not bury ghosts. Rumors began in Dublin, whispers that one of the lost princes, the younger of the two boys murdered in the Tower, had escaped. He was alive, they said, and ready to reclaim his father's crown. The name spread like fire through England's taverns and castles. Edward, the true son of York, Henry dismissed it at first. but the whispers would not die. Then came reports that Ireland had crowned this Edward as King Edward VI, complete with Yorkist lords and foreign mercenaries swearing allegiance. The boy's true name, history would later say, was Lambert Simnel, the son of an Oxford tradesman, trained by conspirators to impersonate the dead prince. But in that moment, truth mattered less than belief. And belief, in a land still haunted by the Wars of the Roses, was a weapon more dangerous than any sword. In the spring of 1487, the Yorkist exiles landed in the north. They were few in number, barely 8,000, but among them marched veterans of Bosworth, Irish soldiers painted for war, and German mercenaries paid by Burgundy's gold. Henry gathered his forces, loyalists from Wales, the Midlands, and London. His army was larger, but many had fought for York before. The red and white roses would face each other once more this time, at Stoke Field, near the River Trent. The morning of June 16th rose thick with mist and thunder. Birds circled above the plain where England would bleed again. Henry's commanders, Oxford, Bedford, and others who had once served under Edward IV formed the lines. Across the valley, the Yorkist banners fluttered defiantly. White lions, silver suns, and a crown painted with memory. Henry rode among his men, his armor plain, his face unreadable. He was no warrior king, yet he knew this day would decide whether his house lived or died before it ever began. The trumpet sounded. The battle began. Arrows fell like rain. The Irish infantry surged forward, barefoot and furious, screaming prayers in Gaelic. They met the royal pikes head-on, the crash echoing across the valley. The field dissolved into chaos, men wrestling in mud, banners trampled, swords clanging. Oxford's veterans held firm, their discipline forged in the fires of France. Slowly, the rebel line began to waver. Then the king gave the order. The archers advanced, unleashing a storm of arrows so dense the sky darkened. Within an hour, the Yorkist army broke. When the smoke cleared, the grass ran red once more. Lincoln lay dead among the fallen. The boy, Simnel, the false prince, was captured alive. Henry looked upon him not with rage, but with the cold calculation of a man who understood power. Rather than execution, he ordered the boy to serve in his kitchens, a living symbol of mercy, or perhaps of mockery. The War of the Roses, some said, had ended again. But in truth, it never truly died. It merely changed its face. The fields of Stoke were quiet now, but England's heartbeat still trembled. The victory banners were folded away, and the new king, Henry Tudor, rode home through a land that had learned to fear its own crown. He had won not just a battle, but the right to breathe. Yet even victory could not cleanse the air of suspicion. The blood of York still lingered in the soil, and Henry knew that ghosts had long memories. In the weeks that followed, the bodies were buried, the wounded forgotten, and proclamations of peace echoed through every parish. But peace, like prophecy, was an illusion England had heard too often before. Henry returned to London as a man transformed. His triumph was absolute, yet his eyes betrayed no joy. He had seen too much of rebellion, too much of ambition. He understood, more deeply than any monarch before him, that kingship was not glory, it was vigilance. He ordered every surviving noble to swear loyalty once again, not to the crown, but to him personally. The oaths were written, signed, and sealed under watchful eyes. Those who hesitated were reminded of Bosworth and Stoke, of what happened to men who gambled against a Tudor. The realm began to change. Where Edward IV had ruled through charm and Richard through fear, Henry ruled through control. The old baronial power, the great families who once raised private armies in the name of roses, were bound by laws and bonds of debt. Each nobleman became both servant and hostage to the crown. Henry called it order. His enemies called it chains. Every rebellion that might have begun in the north, or the marches, was smothered in its cradle. Informants filled the taverns. Sheriffs carried lists of names written in the king's precise hand. Even the great dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk learned to bow low and speak softly. The age of chivalric warlords was over. The age of accountants had begun. Henry VII surrounded himself with men who wielded quills instead of swords, lawyers, financiers, clerks who knew how to measure loyalty in coin. The exchequer overflowed with fines and forfeitures. Every rebellion, real or imagined, became another entry in the royal ledger. Gold built his walls. Fear kept them standing. He strengthened the power of the Star Chamber, a court that answered only to him. Its judgments were swift and silent. Its victims vanished without rumor or trial. Under its shadow, England learned obedience. To the weary commoner, this was a welcome tyranny. After decades of blood, they preferred a silent king to a shouting one. The markets filled again, trade returned, and the harvest was no longer burned in the name of banners. The people did not love Henry, but they trusted his caution, and that, for him, was enough. The Queen, Elizabeth of York, gave birth to a son in the autumn of 1486. Arthur, Prince of Wales. The nation rejoiced. The union of roses had produced a child. Priests declared the civil wars ended at last. The king ordered coins minted with his son's name, as if the future could be cast in silver. But fate, as Henry knew well, was never loyal. The peace of the early Tudor court was fragile, a mirror that could shatter with one false reflection. And in 1491, the reflection appeared. In Flanders, a young man claimed to be Richard of York, the younger of the two princes murdered in the Tower years before. Unlike the peasant boy Lambert Simnel, this pretender spoke with royal grace, wrote with the hand of a scholar, and carried the bearing of a prince. He called himself Perkin Warbeck. To the desperate Yorkists who still dreamed of the white rose, he was salvation reborn. To Henry, he was a nightmare made flesh. The roses had stopped bleeding, but England had not yet learned how to heal. The war was over, they said, yet every stone of London whispered of old loyalties. The blood of York still ran in noble veins. The pride of Lancaster still colored sermons. But for the first time in living memory, there was only one throne, and only one name that mattered: Tudor. King Henry VII ruled with a hand as cold as iron. His victory at Bosworth had ended the Plantagenet age, yet his heart remained chained to its ghosts. Each dawn he rose before the court, not to pray, but to count gold, allies, spies. He trusted arithmetic more than men. The Tudor court was not like those that came before. Gone were the feasts of Edward IV, the parades of Richard II, the wine-soaked revels of Lancaster's kings. Henry's palace was a library of silence. Candles burned low, and clerks scratched parchment long into the night. The corridors of Greenwich and Westminster echoed not with laughter, but the shuffling of accountants and the whispers of informants. Yet in that stillness, England was reborn. The merchants of London, long crushed beneath the weight of noble wars, found their ships free to sail again. Flemish cloth and Italian silks returned to the docks. The coinage stabilized. The royal treasury grew. The people began to call it the peace of the Tudor. But peace, as Henry knew, was simply the silence between storms. He spent years weaving a web so intricate that even the lords who despised him could not escape it. Bonds, oaths, debts, each family tied to the crown by paper and fear. The nobility learned to smile through clenched teeth. Rebellion had become too expensive to afford. Still, he understood that control alone could not build a dynasty. It had to be sanctified not by force, but by blood. And so Henry looked not to the battlefield, but to the cradle. The birth of Prince Arthur had been his triumph, the first child of red and white united. Yet Henry's gaze was already fixed beyond the kingdom's borders. To secure England's fragile peace, he would tie it to Europe's strongest crowns. In 1489, he signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo with Spain, a pact of trade, defense, and destiny. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, agreed to wed their youngest daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to Arthur. It was a union of continents, the joining of England's hard-won stability with the might of Catholic Europe. The people rejoiced. Chroniclers proclaimed that the age of endless blood was finished, that the roses, at last, had flowered. But beneath every alliance, Henry still saw shadows. Spain's favor was fleeting. France's ambitions loomed across the Channel. The Scots eyed the northern borders like wolves in winter. He strengthened his watch spies in Calais, agents in Flanders, coded letters from the Vatican to London. Even as his enemies grew distant, his paranoia remained close. He had reason. In the north, the De la Poles, cousins of the late Yorkist kings, still lived quiet, polite, and dangerous. The eldest, Edmund de la Pole, whispered of bloodlines older than Tudor. Henry smiled upon him in public and taxed him in private, until even friendship became another form of prison. The war might have ended, but the hunger for crowns had not. Elizabeth of York, queen, peacemaker, daughter of kings, carried herself with grace amid the cold machinery of her husband's court. She was the warmth he lacked, the symbol he needed. To her people, she was still the daughter of Edward IV, the light of the old York glory. To Henry, she was legitimacy wrapped in silk. She bore him sons and daughters, Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary, each child a living thread in the tapestry of Tudor power. For all his calculation, even Henry could not remain untouched by the sight of his family gathered beneath candlelight. The laughter of children was the only sound that softened his severity. Elizabeth's calm presence steadied his fears, and for fleeting moments he seemed almost content. But fate, as always, would not allow peace to bloom for long. In the spring of 1492, the king's spies brought word of another name whispered in foreign courts, Richard of York. Again, another pretender claiming the blood of the vanished princes. It was Perkin Warbeck, a youth of mysterious birth, raised in the courts of Burgundy and paraded as the rightful heir of York. The Duchess Margaret, sister of Edward IV, claimed him as her nephew and armed him with gold and men. Henry's face did not change when he received the reports, but those closest to him felt the temperature of the room drop. He had fought one ghost already, now another had risen. Warbeck's story was almost perfect. His accent was noble, his manner regal, his memory of court life unnervingly precise. For many who had served Edward IV, he was the image of a lost prince returned from the grave. Europe listened. France welcomed him. Burgundy sheltered him. Scotland even crowned him guest and ally. Henry responded as he always did, not with rage, but with precision. He built walls of treaties instead of armies, cutting Warbeck off from every harbor and every purse. He sent agents across the sea to bribe, deceive, and silence. In time, Warbeck would fall, but for now, the shadow lingered, and the new dynasty trembled under its weight. Still, in the eyes of most Englishmen, the Tudors had succeeded where the Plantagenets had failed. For the first time in a century, the realm was not torn between rival heirs. The royal coffers overflowed, trade thrived, and no English army marched against another. The people could finally look forward instead of back. Yet Henry VII, the architect of that peace, never truly believed in it. He ruled as if the roses might bloom red again at any moment, as if every calm day were only the breath before a storm. And perhaps he was right, because in his careful world of treaties and bonds, there was one thing he could not control: time. The sons and daughters he raised beneath his cautious peace were not children of war, but of ambition. They had never seen England bleed, only prosper. And they would dream of empires larger than any Henry dared imagine. The Tudor sun rose slowly, but every dawn seemed colder. By the late 1492, England had known peace longer than any living man could remember yet within the royal palace. Silence had turned from strength into shadow. King Henry VII, who had once conquered the throne through fire and blood, now ruled from behind doors heavy with locks. He trusted fewer faces, smiled at fewer names, and spoke less with each passing year. He had built his dynasty upon fear, fear of rebellion, fear of pretenders, fear of losing what war had once given him. And now, in the stillness of victory, That same fear became his companion. Elizabeth of York remained the light of his reign. Her beauty was not of jewels or paint, but of quiet endurance. She soothed the court's unease with her grace, held her husband's temper with her gentleness, and made the Tudor court for a time a place of warmth in a kingdom still recovering from centuries of winter. Together they watched their children grow. Arthur, the crown prince, calm and bookish, molded for diplomacy. Margaret, sharp-minded and willful, a mirror of her grandmother's pride. And Henry, the second son, restless, brilliant, and hungry for admiration. Henry VII saw in the boy what he feared most: ambition. He tried to temper it with lessons of patience and prudence, drilling into him the creed of his reign: never trust what can be taken. But young Henry loved stories of knights and heroes, of tournaments and crusades. He studied the legends of Alexander and Arthur more eagerly than the laws of England. Where his father hoarded coin, Henry dreamed of banners. In those years, the Tudor household was a mirror of England itself: peace on the surface, tension beneath. The court glittered with tapestries and Italian fashion, but every noble guest still measured their words, for spies were said to dine at the same tables as dukes. Henry's network of informants reached into every shire. The old Yorkists were watched, fined, and bled of wealth until rebellion was no longer a risk, only a memory. And then, in 1497, the past returned one final time. Perkin Warbeck, the boy who had claimed to be Richard of York, landed once more on English soil. For years, he had wandered from court to court, the last ghost of the Plantagenet line. Now, with dwindling followers, he made a desperate bid for glory. Henry's army crushed him without mercy. The pretender was captured, paraded through London in chains, and imprisoned in the Tower. The king did not kill him at once. Instead, he let him rot a living warning to those who dreamed of old crowns. But Warbeck did not die alone. In 1499, Henry also ordered the execution of Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last true York heir, long held captive since boyhood. The act ensured Tudor security, but it also extinguished the final ember of the Plantagenet bloodline. Some said that night, when the axe fell in the Tower courtyard, the king did not sleep. Even Henry's enemies whispered that he wept. With the ghosts of York finally gone, England's future seemed safe. Yet destiny, as always, had its own design. In 1501, the court prepared for a union that promised to seal England's peace in gold: the marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess promised since infancy. The wedding was a spectacle of triumph. Westminster Abbey blazed with candlelight. The streets were strewn with flowers. Bells rang as if to declare that war itself had been buried. Henry watched his son kneel beside Catherine, his expression unreadable. He had given England a dynasty. Now he hoped his son would give it an empire. But winter followed celebration. In the spring of 1502, Arthur fell ill in Ludlow Castle, a fever swift and merciless. The doctors came too late. The Prince of Peace, heir of two roses, died before he could rule. When the message reached London, Henry's composure cracked. Witnesses said he locked himself away for days. Elizabeth of York, ever steadfast, comforted him with words of faith that they still had each other, that God's will was beyond their understanding. But grief is a cruel guest. It does not leave quietly. A year later, Elizabeth herself grew weak after giving birth to a daughter who did not live. Her body failed her, and on a February night in 1503, the Queen of England, the woman who had united red and white, closed her eyes for the last time. Henry was never the same again. The king, who had outwitted armies and crushed rebellions, now found himself powerless against loneliness. The great tapestries of Westminster seemed to hang heavier, the air colder. He withdrew from public view, his crown less a symbol of triumph than a weight upon his skull. He no longer attended feasts or tournaments. His once lively court became a ledger of debts and treaties. The joy that had colored the early Tudor years faded to gray parchment and candle smoke. In those days, his surviving son, young Henry, began to draw the eyes of the court. Tall, strong, golden-haired, he was everything his father was not. Charming, reckless, magnetic. Ambassadors from Europe spoke of him as a prince destined for greatness. Henry VII watched him with equal pride and fear. He knew that in the boy's blood ran not only Tudor discipline but Yorkist fire, the restless ambition that had built and destroyed kings before him. The king tightened his grip on the realm. Trade agreements with the Low Countries, treaties with Spain and Scotland, the slow construction of the Royal Navy, all were crafted not for glory, but for endurance. Henry had seen what glory cost. He wanted survival. In 1506, fate granted him one last victory. A storm drove Philip of Burgundy, the powerful ruler of Flanders and husband to Joanna of Castile, onto English shores. Henry treated him with exquisite courtesy and subtle coercion. By the time Philip sailed home, he had sworn friendship, paid tribute, and handed over one final prize: Edmund de la Pole, York's last living claimant. Henry's enemies were gone, his dynasty secure. Yet he felt no triumph. In the dark corridors of Richmond Palace, he walked alone. His counselors noted his growing frailty, the tremor in his hands. His nights were filled with prayer and the scratching of quills as he revised his ledgers one final time, counting, always counting. In April 1509, the man who had ended the Wars of the Roses finally laid down his crown. He was buried beside Elizabeth at Westminster, the union of red and white eternal in death, as it had been in life. And in the echo of the bells, a new chapter began. The boy who had once stood in his father's shadow, Henry VIII, now stood beneath a crown heavy with both peace and expectation. The child of war had inherited a kingdom born from ashes, but unlike his father, he would not count coins, he would count conquests. The Tudor rose had bloomed, and soon it would burn. The wars had ended, but the roses never truly died. Beneath the polished marble of Westminster, beneath the sermons of peace and prosperity, England still carried the scent of blood. The Tudors had buried the bodies, rewritten the chronicles, and built cathedrals over the graves, yet every stone whispered of the price that bought the calm. When Henry VII was laid beside Elizabeth of York in 1509, the roses red and white were carved together upon their tomb. To the eyes of the court, it was the symbol of unity. To the old and the weary, it was a reminder of everything lost to achieve it. That same year, a new monarch rose, Henry VIII, a king born not in war, but in victory. He had known no battlefield, no rebellion, no fear. He was the first English ruler to inherit peace rather than earn it. And yet, peace was not what stirred his blood. The young Henry was everything. His father was not radiant, impulsive, hungry for spectacle. Where Henry VII had built his dynasty with ledgers and treaties, his son sought to gild it with glory. He reopened the tournament grounds, revived the ancient chivalric orders, and filled his court with musicians, poets, and scholars from across Europe. England's dark silence began to hum again with laughter, with song, with ambition. The roses that had once bled now bloomed in gold. But even in splendor, the shadows remained. The counselors who had served his father watched in silence as the boy king turned their caution into confidence, their diplomacy into desire. They saw the pride of Lancaster and the charm of York fused in one man, and they feared what such a union might unleash. In Henry VIII's veins flowed the legacy of a century's war. The ruthlessness of Margaret of Anjou, the charisma of Edward IV, and the suspicion of his father, Henry VII. It was the blood of survivors and destroyers. At his side stood Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess once promised to his brother Arthur. Their marriage symbolized the fulfillment of everything the Wars of the Roses had promised: stability, alliance, and divine favor. England was reborn proud, pious, and united. But history never forgets its patterns. The Tudor crown, though gilded, still carried the fractures of the roses. In time, ambition would rot the petals again. Henry's reign began in triumph. But beneath the feasts and proclamations lay an unspoken truth: the dynasty was still young, fragile, and desperate to secure its future. The fear that had haunted Henry VII now passed quietly to his son, the fear of extinction. Without an heir, peace was illusion. So the king, who had been shaped by legends, began to chase his own. His search for a son for permanence would ignite a new kind of war, not between roses, but between faiths. As monasteries burned and priests fled, the ghosts of old England stirred once more. The battlefields were now churches. The blood spilled was ink. What had begun as a struggle for crowns became a struggle for souls. And in the irony of history, the Reformation, the great fracture of Christendom, was born from the very dynasty that had once claimed to heal a divided realm. The Wars of the Roses had ended in the body, but not in the spirit. Every Tudor carried the echo of that conflict. Each sought to command what no one before them had truly mastered: loyalty. For Henry VIII, loyalty meant obedience to his crown, his will, and his church. For his daughter Elizabeth I, loyalty would mean something deeper: survival in a world of wolves. Through them, the legacy of the Roses endured not in banners, but in bloodlines. Lancaster's persistence, York's pride, the same duality that had torn England apart now pulsed in the heart of its greatest monarchs. From the crimson fields of Towton to the golden halls of Hampton Court, one truth never changed: England was built on the tension between order and defiance, crown and conscience, duty and desire. And the Tudors, descendants of both victors and victims, became the living embodiment of that struggle. In the 16th century, when foreign ambassadors wrote of England, they did not speak of its peace. They spoke of its contradictions: a nation both ancient and new, both devout and defiant, both fearful and fearless. The War of the Roses had ended with swords, but its shadow would guide centuries of kings. In the years that followed Henry VIII's death, the Tudor throne became a mirror of everything the Roses had fought to prevent a kingdom divided once more, not by lineage, but by belief. His son, Edward VI, inherited both crown and chaos. Barely a boy, he reigned in name, while noblemen ruled in his stead. Under the watchful eyes of regents, England transformed into a Protestant nation. Monasteries lay in ruins, their stones sold to the very peasants who once knelt before their altars. The gold of the church now filled royal coffers, and the relics of saints were replaced by sermons in steel. But Edward's reign was brief, a candle flickering against a wind that had never stopped blowing since St. Albans. He died young, consumed by illness and pressure, leaving behind a faith without foundation and a realm trembling at its edges. From the ashes of his boyhood came a queen forged in fear, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, determined to restore her mother's faith. She brought the red rose of Lancaster back to the altar, soaked it in blood, and called it salvation. Her fires burned not on battlefields, but in city squares, a different kind of war for a different kind of crown. They called her Bloody Mary. Yet in her heart was the same desperation that had haunted every monarch since Henry VI, to heal what was broken. But faith cannot mend what power has shattered. Her reign ended in flames and sorrow, and with it, the old dream of unity through faith was consumed. When Mary died in 1558, the torch passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn and the Spirit of York. With her, the final bloom of the Roses opened. Elizabeth understood what no king before her had learned: that peace was not won by blood, but by patience. Her reign, though draped in grandeur, was born of ghosts. Every decision carried the memory of civil war. Every alliance balanced the weight of faith and fear. She ruled not through armies or heirs, but through Image Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of both Roses united. In her eyes burned the fire of her grandfather's ambition and the caution of her mother's fall. She had watched queens die for love, kings die for pride, and nations die for faith. So she chose something rarer: endurance. Under her hand, England rose from the graveyard of its own past. Ships that once carried soldiers now carried explorers. The banners of the red and white were replaced by sails of white and gold, crossing seas no Englishman had ever seen. From London's docks to the Caribbean, from Calais' loss to Virginia's birth, the realm that had torn itself apart now began to conquer the world. And yet Elizabeth ruled as one who knew her crown was a ghost. Every step she took echoed through the marble of Westminster, where her ancestors lay: Henry, Edward, Richard, the restless bones of the roses. She walked their corridors not in triumph, but in remembrance. The Tudors had ended the war, but they had never escaped it. It lived in their blood, in their choices, in the fear that the peace they built would never last. When Elizabeth died in 1603, alone and childless, she carried the final breath of the Tudor line. Her crown passed to the House of Stuart, but her legend did not die. The war that began with family had ended with empire. The England that rose from it would not be the same, nor would Europe. In time, poets and painters would romanticize the Tudors, turning their blood into myth and their ambition into destiny. But beneath the lace and marble, the truth remained: it had all begun in a garden of thorns. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York still bloomed side by side, carved into stone, embroidered on banners, engraved on coins. They no longer fought for power. They had become the symbol of something greater: rebirth through ruin. History remembers the victors, but the War of the Roses left no victors, only survivors. Its lesson was written not in ink, but in consequence: that unity born of conquest is never peace, and that crowns, like roses, are beautiful only until they bleed. As centuries passed, the echoes of that war shaped every throne, every rebellion, every dream of England's destiny. From the beheadings of kings to the rise of parliaments, from the colonization of the New World to the creation of the British Empire, all bore the same mark, the same inheritance of division and endurance. The War of the Roses did not end in 1485. It merely changed its name. And yet, from that long night of betrayal and blood, something eternal had grown: a nation unafraid of its scars, a people shaped by struggle, and a legacy too vast to die. The roses had fallen silent, but England born from their thorns would never sleep again. From the blood of kings grew a kingdom that outlived them all. From two roses came one empire. If you've journeyed through this story of betrayal and rebirth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because history isn't finished. It's waiting for those who dare to remember.